Good day to all of you, and welcome to this dialogue on advancing land and territorial rights for Indigenous peoples. This event is co-organized by the International Land Coalition, the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, or IWGIA, the Forest Peoples Program, FPP, and the Indigenous Peoples Rights International, IPRI. I am Joanne Carling of IPRI, and I will be moderating this important dialogue that we are having today. But before I proceed, let me make some announcement of house rules. First is you can introduce yourself using the chat box. And then also you can type in your questions in the Q&A, or during the forum, you can raise your hand, but kindly be short in terms of your intervention of no more than a minute, because we want to get as much interaction as possible. So when you ask directly your question or comment, kindly be mindful
d'échange et d'interaction.
El tiempo que tienen a disposición.
We want this session to be as interactive as possible. You can also put in your recommendations in the chat box. The recommendations would be, of course, around the theme of our discussion today, which is advancing land and territorial rights of Indigenous peoples. Then I would also like to announce that there is translation for French and Spanish. So kindly use the button for interpreter to the language you are comfortable with. And finally, to also say that this meeting is recorded. So if you have any concerns, kindly let us know through the chat box. So those are the house rules for this meeting. So since this is more of a dialogue, it's quite informal. This is not a webinar, but more of a dialogue for where we can tackle this important issue on Indigenous peoples, lands, territories, and resources. So as a background to this dialogue, this year, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues launched a new global report on rights to lands, territories, and resources that examines successful practices, continuing obstacles and challenges, and proposed strategies to realize Indigenous peoples' rights to land, territories, and resources. This event, this side event, which is also now happening during the Permanent Forum, is to build around key critical areas in the report, and the discussion will be oriented to understand current trends and explore concrete opportunities to scale up political and financial support to realize Indigenous peoples' rights to lands, territories, and resources. Now, the format that we have for this dialogue is first to have an overview of the report of the Permanent Forum. Afterwards, a representative from Women and Youth will present the specific issues in relation to land rights. That's called the first panel. And then we will have a second panel that will address territorial governance, self-determination, and natural resources. And finally, the third panel would be strategic lobbying and litigation to influence regional and international bodies or mechanisms. Now, for each segment, we will open up for some discussion before we move to the next. And in order for us to be able to do this, may I urgently humbly request our speakers to kindly stick to the time limitation of 5 minutes for each. So that would end. And by the way, at the end, after the third panel, I hope we have more time to also get more recommendations from you, either through the chat or through your interventions. So now let's start the program with Anne Norgam, the chair of the Permanent Forum now, to share to us the highlights on the key findings of the UN Permanent Forum report on the state of the world's indigenous peoples, rights to lands, territories, and resources. So Anne, you have the floor.
Thank you, Joanne. Kiitos. Indigenous sisters and brothers, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for invitation to this side event on advancing Indigenous peoples' land and territorial rights. I'm going to introduce some of the key findings of the Permanent Forum report, the state of world's Indigenous peoples' right to lands, territories, and resources. And it looks like this. And along with the right to autonomy and self-determination, the right to lands, territories, and resources, both of which are enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, are central to the very survival of Indigenous peoples, our culture, spiritual and physical survival, and well-being. And yet, as we see in the news on a regular basis, conflicts over Indigenous lands, territories, and resources continue to be a source of human rights violations, violence, and murder. In fact, the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent lockdowns have seen an upswing in the cases of encroachment onto Indigenous lands and territories. The sources of the conflicts are many, from resource extraction, logging, land and renewable energy sources, and agribusiness, to conflict between Indigenous pastoralists, nomadic herders, and farmers over shrinking grazing lands due to the war and the effects of climate change, as well as the establishment of conservation areas. The lack of respect for the principle and the meaning of free, prior, and informed consent by the governments and the private sector continues unabated. And in too many countries, Indigenous peoples are still not legally recognized, immediately undermining their control over their lands and resources. Indigenous women have been at the forefront of the struggle to secure land and territorial rights and equitable representation in all aspects of society for themselves and ultimately for their entire communities. The loss of natural resources and biodiversity is the loss to our traditional roles. I'd like to touch on a few of these issues, which are covered extensively in the publication, with some examples based on my own experience as a Sami from northern Finland. Today, many of the remaining unexploited lands and resources are under Indigenous stewardship. For example, the publication notes that the state of affairs in Philippines and Peru is illustrative of that in many mineral-rich countries, with 72% of all approved large-scale mining applications in the Philippines located in the Indigenous territories, and 75% of the Peruvian Amazon covered by oil and gas concessions. These numbers are huge. The destruction of environment from illegal mining and logging is also growing. Ecuador, Brazil, and Venezuela are specifically mentioned in this publication. There have been exposed illegal selling and deforestation of Indigenous lands in the Brazilian Amazon in the past months. In these and many other countries, violence and persecution against environmental human rights defenders is growing. I'm also concerned by the expansion of agribusiness on indigenous lands, and particularly those that cause extensive destruction of the environment and a huge loss of biodiversity. The publication notes that the impact of palm oil production is particularly profound in Southeast Asia, with Indonesia and Malaysia accounting for 85% of palm oil products. Extensive palm oil plantations exist in or are planned for the territories of indigenous peoples in a growing number of countries, including Thailand, Papua New Guinea, Cambodia, the Philippines, Colombia, Guatemala, Cameroon, Liberia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And further that, according to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, oil palm expansion is devastating for biodiversity and could affect 54% of all threatened mammals and 64% of all threatened birds globally, while displacing many other species as well as indigenous communities. Carbon emissions from the clearing of forests on peatland and methane released from waste make the palm oil sector one of the major contributors of global warming. Palm oil does not benefit the average citizen of Malaysia or Indonesia. Most of it's exported to India or Europe. Typically, projects such as these are often justified by reference to development and national interests, but do little for the national economy, while enriching a small group of middlemen with environmental devastation and human rights violations for the local people who are often indigenous. The same can be said for the soybean plantations in East Africa, gold mines in Guatemala, or national parks in Kenya. The rights of indigenous peoples are sacrificed for the profits of the few. Monocrops such as palm oil are produced for renewable energy, which leads to the wider issue of the desecration of indigenous lands and ways of life for green energy projects. In fact, in Samiland, we have issued with the concentration of wind turbines on reindeer migrating lands. And we have quite many cases. And some of our cases have ended up in UN treaty bodies. And the last case was from Sweden in December, so-called Rennbäcken case, where the Sami people won over the government of Sweden on, and the issue was building to the reindeer herding lands. But the case still needs to be, or the decisions still needs to be implemented by the Swedish government. Agribusiness, close on the heels of extractive industries, has become a major source of violence against human rights defenders. In these cases, too, free, prior and informed consent and agreement by indigenous peoples on how projects should be undertaken on their lands must be respected. Unknown to most people, many indigenous peoples continue to suffer from lands that were illegally acquired for conservation and tourism, with forced relocation and bans from hunting and gathering on those lands. This is widespread in a number of African countries, including Botswana, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, but also in various Asian countries. Not only were indigenous peoples evicted and lost their source of livelihoods and culture, most receive no benefits from the revenues generated by these conservation areas, beyond if they are able to establish handicraft or similar businesses close to these areas. This is another example where the rights of local indigenous population is sacrificed for conservation model that favors foreign tourists over the livelihoods and the human rights of indigenous peoples. Of course, conservation is extremely important, and I welcome efforts to designate more national parks and more conservation areas.
Más parques nacionales, pero si queremos ser serios acerca de esta cuestión, lo que tenemos que
hacerlo en
es que
colaboración con la
junto con
gente.
las personas locales tenemos que respetar a sus derechos, sobre todo el derecho a un consenso informado. Podemos hacer algo mejor. La Declaración de los Derechos que, digamos, las Naciones Unidas han aprobado, podemos mejorar. Queda claro que los gobiernos
Cómo hacer con los pueblos
quieren hablar de
indígenas.
estos derechos, pero tenemos que seguir, dar un seguimiento a estas acciones y velar por medio del Foro de los Pueblos Indígenas con la ayuda de agencias de las Naciones Unidas y ONG. Y necesitamos que los Estados miembros, el sector privado y otras partes interesadas puedan, digamos, respetar, digamos, la implementación de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas conforme a la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas. Y es muy importante seguir adelante con este digamos, seguimiento, con el informe sobre la situación de los pueblos indígenas, sus territorios, sus recursos, y ver cómo podemos implementar los descubrimientos importantes de este informe y para que las personas se conciencien cada vez más acerca de los derechos de estos pueblos indígenas y sus...
Ces populations autochtones sont violées partout dans le monde. Merci de cela, Annie.
The report, and just to state again what you said, that what's needed now are real actions to have the rights of indigenous peoples recognized by states, and for indigenous peoples to realize or exercise these rights. So now I thank you for that, Anne, and I hope our participants have the time to read the report. It's very, very rich in terms of really capturing the key issues and concerns of indigenous peoples as presented to us by Anne. But more importantly is also how can we strengthen our cooperation to make the necessary, to push for the necessary changes. So thanks again, Anne. Now we move on to the first panel, which is for indigenous women and youth. But I was informed that Hindu cannot have difficulties connecting. So now I will call on Luz Marina Lopez from the Red de Jóvenes América Latina. So Luz, you have the floor.
Hi, everybody. Tita Ñamni, Malsutra. Buenos días, hermanos y hermanas. Desde la Red de Jóvenes Indígenas y sus procesos de base, queremos agradecer a ILC por la invitación a este importante evento. Para los jóvenes, la defensa de los territorios es defender nuestra UNPFII, porque es ahí de donde venimos. Nuestros abuelos y nuestras abuelas siempre nos han marcado que sin nuestros territorios somos seres vacíos. Todo lo que nuestros ancestros han luchado es una enseñanza de vida, es nuestra identidad, por lo que en la actualidad seguimos luchando por buscar la armonía con la madre tierra. Pues cada vez más nos enfrentamos a nuevos desafíos, como el cambio climático, los desastres naturales, las pandemias como el COVID-19 y virus mayores como los saqueadores e invasores de empresas extractivas. Los desafíos por la defensa de nuestros territorios y por el reconocimiento de nuestros derechos colectivos.
They are really violating our rights, and we are still fighting for it. Indigenous peoples are resilient, but I think in the future we will have credit for it because we really value our traditions, our traditional medicine, and also all our rights, all our values. So we've been helping with our knowledge other peoples, so maybe not indigenous peoples, but other type of people. So we have been helping them so much. We are problem solvers. We try to find solutions to every situation, but of course, indigenous peoples are not recognized in their territories. They are facing a huge challenge. They don't have the control of their food and the produce of their land. And of course, they are no longer capable to control the capacity of their production. And specifically with this pandemic, with this COVID-19, this has been, let's say, the justification to use
Justification pour utiliser des mesures.
Para los jóvenes indígenas, el territorio se paga con la vida. Así nos lo expresan nuestros hermanos de Colombia, México, Brasil y Bolivia. La falta de solidaridad y la reciprocidad nos deja solos ante empresas transnacionales. La presidenta del Foro Permanente nos ha hablado de crear ambientes saludables para medios de vida sostenibles, pero sin nuestras tierras y nuestros territorios solo creamos inseguridades alimentarias. Lo mencionaba ella misma. Es por eso que los pueblos indígenas llamamos a la participación plena e integral, construida desde nuestras bases de pueblo. Que los jóvenes seamos los protagonistas de nuestro presente, pues la pandemia hemos visto hermanos creando métodos para enfrentar estos procesos, como las hermanas mayas de Guatemala y Bolivia que crearon mascarillas, o los jóvenes de Nicaragua que nos organizamos para hacer un proceso de concientización y sensibilización con nuestras propias lenguas. O nuestros hermanos de Uruguay que se organizaron.
Maybe some brothers of Uruguay, they have been helping the elderly with specific cultivation in their own land. Or maybe some other sisters, they have their own community cultivation system. This is why in our network of indigenous young people, we are really urging states and organizations the full participation of indigenous peoples in order to build real and concrete solutions for indigenous people.
Con la participación real de la consulta libre, previa e informada, a la protección de las y los defensores del territorio y así a crear mecanismos de protección y de seguridad, así como generar protocolos de emergencia. Exhortamos a dar cumplimiento a los acuerdos de Escazú en nuestra región. Como jóvenes de la UNPFII seguimos buscando, innovando, creando y desarrollando ideas, pero también seguimos resistiendo a nuestra existencia.
Resisting all these new forces.
Okay, thank you, Luz, for highlighting the impact of the pandemic as it relates to lands and territories and resources, and the link on food security or food production and economic control instead of the companies. And also, it's a good point that you have highlighted the mechanism for protocol for indigenous peoples protection of their lands, territories, and resources. Now, I open up for some questions for Anne or for Luz. We have 5 minutes to do that. So if anyone, you can, there are 2 ways you can participate. One, through the chat box. There's actually 3, through the chat box, through the Q&A, and by raising your hand. So anyone who wants to, okay, Sanjeev, I see your hand. You're given 1 minute. Sanjeev.
Thank you, Joanne. This is a very great event and very important for indigenous peoples. I think that the national level are the big
señores y dueños.
Like Bangladesh, we are following colonial land laws still, the British time. So I think we should work strongly for adopting national law in favor of indigenous people's land rights. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very important recommendation, Sanjeev. So the recommendation would be to review and reform laws, no? To align it for the full recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples over their lands, territories, and resources. Okay, anyone else who wants to say something, or anyone who wants to share more recommendations, also in response to the challenges that Luz has mentioned? If you have some recommendations on this or any other points relating to also how we can put the youth in the front line of our defense of our lands, territories, and resources. Oh, I see Diyarmud Muid Wickham. Yes.
Yes, thank you. This is a question for Anne Norgum about your point of wind turbines on reindeer herding lands. The question is, how can indigenous peoples align themselves with the coming green economy to avoid having that economy be just like the extractive industry that came before in terms of indigenous lands? Thank you.
Yes, okay, that's in relation to renewable energy. Anne, I give you the floor to respond quickly.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. In the Sami case, some reindeer herding reindeer herders are they have their own communities. They are called reindeer herding cooperatives. And in Sweden, some of the reindeer herding cooperation, as well as in Finland, they have made agreements.
Ils lèvent les rênes. Ils ont fait des accords.
Con empresas de
agreements. They are private, but so in each agreement, the part of the revenues are directed to the reindeer herding companies, reindeer herding cooperatives, collectively for the Sami who live in that area. But then in some of the cases, there have been no agreements, and the Sami people have not accepted those companies coming to their lands, and those have led to the court cases and so on.
Yes.
So there is that's an answer.
Yes, thank you for the response, Anne. It's really clear that this green economy is a double edge when it comes to indigenous peoples. If it's not fully aligned with the respect of our rights and for equity, it will be the same. The way they build this renewable energy in indigenous territories is actually again a cause of land grabbing. So I hope the case that you filed will be successful. That indeed the court will uphold the rights of indigenous peoples. So now I think now I don't see any more hands unless or any in the chat box. But now we can proceed. I see Hindu is now here. So now Hindu will also present on the issues of women in relation to land rights. Hindu is a member of the permanent forum from Chad, Africa. So Hindu, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sister Joanne, and hi everyone. I'm so sorry to join late. There is so many things that going on, as you all know. But I'm going to speak in French this time. I did all this morning in English and I'm getting a bit confused in my brain. Alors, je voudrais vous parler des droits à la terre chez nous. Déjà, sachant que je viens d'une communauté autochtone.
An indigenous pastoral community. but we also have indigenous
comunidades de diferentes tipos en el.
Faut d'abord comprendre les droits à la terre en général est défini dans les constitutions des États. Et la plupart, la terre, on dit, les sols, les sous-sols appartiennent à l'État. Or, dans les constitutions, il y a des prévisions qui disent que les droits traditionnels sont reconnus. Alors, du coup, ça crée un peu de confusion sur la définition des droits à la terre au niveau institutionnel. Alors, si on va dans les communautés au niveau local, et je vous donne l'exemple de ma communauté à moi, nous avons le droit collectif parce que comme on est des pasteurs et nomades dépendants de la nature, on se promène sur le couloir de transhumance, les zones de stationnement. Alors, les zones sont divisées en 3 parties. Il y a les parties agricoles, il y a les parties pastorales, mais il y a aussi des zones de pêche qui sont autour de l'eau. Or, il n'y a pas de législation claire qui les définisse. Au Tchad, nous avons la loi numéro 4 qui est de 1958 pendant la colonisation, qui régisse les droits à la terre pastorale, dont la terre de ma communauté, et les droits des terres normaux pour l'agriculture. Alors, il n'y a pas l'actualisation qui permet de décentraliser les droits à la terre et de définir les couloirs de transhumance. Et là, généralement, quand on parle de ça, on ne parle pas des droits des terres des femmes. Et c'est dans les communautés qu'on connaît comment définir les droits des terres de chacun. La deuxième des choses, quand on parle de législation nationale, c'est différent, mais il y a aussi la religion qui définit les droits à la terre autrement. Et là, il y a les discriminations entre les femmes et les hommes. Donc, on dit, si un parent a une parcelle de 100 mètres carrés et il a 2 enfants, une fille et un garçon, donc, on doit diviser la parcelle en 3 parties. Les 2 parties, on donne au garçon et une partie, on donne à la femme. Et or, quand on vient dans les communautés, donc les parcelles ne sont pas définies en individu, c'est collectif. Ce qui est défini, c'est qu'est-ce qui fait l'activité sur la terre. Pour le pastoralisme, on a le bœuf. Alors, le bœuf qui font partie de notre course dans l'accès à la terre, ça s'applique aussi les droits religieux. Si quelqu'un a 10 bœufs et il a 2 enfants, il doit les diviser en 3 parties. C'est une partie qui est revenue à la femme. Et là, directement sur ma propre famille, genre ma mère, comme c'est une femme, comme elle a hérité ce bœuf, c'est pas elle qui le prend, qui va au pâturage. Donc, elle doit les laisser à son frère ou à son cousin.
Them to the pastoral land, but she has to leave them to the brothers.
Tiene que dejarlos al hermano o al primo.
Des droits à la terre et des droits de l'usage même de la terre, c'est défini. Et si jamais elle vient pour dire, je vais vendre mes bœufs, c'est pas à elle de décider qu'elle va vendre le BA ou le BB ou le BC. Ils vont lui dire, ben non, on a besoin de celui-là, tu ne peux pas le vendre. Alors, le droit à la décision sur l'appartenance même à la femme est très, très limité. Ce qui fait que quand en 2015, on est revenu sur la discussion sur le code pastoral. Et alors, il y a eu la première discussion qui a réussi à adopter par le Parlement, qui a été rejetée, encore adoptée, encore rejetée. Alors, la raison en est qu'il n'y a pas de législation claire déjà définie en général sur le droit à la terre. Et quand on revient sur le droit des terres des peuples autochtones et en particulier sur les femmes, ce n'est pas défini. Et c'est là où nous, dans mon organisation et plusieurs autres personnes, on a essayé de faire des projets. Je vous donne l'exemple du projet de la cartographie participative à 3 dimensions. Alors, pour nous, pourquoi on a fait la cartographie? On l'a fait pour essayer de redonner le droit à la terre aux communautés et surtout la décision aux femmes qui peuvent aussi avoir les droits. Donc, la cartographie a permis de mettre les connaissances traditionnelles et les connaissances scientifiques et où les gens sont venus mettre les grands repères. Et les femmes sont venues aussi pour mettre les repères parce qu'elles utilisent la terre pour leur nourriture, pour collecter des fruits, pour collecter la médecine traditionnelle, ainsi de suite. Donc, elles maîtrisent la terre beaucoup mieux. Et avec les impacts du changement climatique, on a encore les terres qui sont accaparées par de grandes institutions. Alors, pour les protéger, on utilise la cartographie participative à 3 dimensions, ce qui a permis à redonner parole et pouvoir aux femmes. Et le deuxième projet, rapidement sur ça, on est en train de faire de l'agroécologie où on va discuter d'abord avec l'autorité locale pour redonner les droits aux terres à la femme et que ces femmes-là vont faire des activités génératrices de revenus pour les valoriser afin de faire les collectivités d'avoir les droits à la terre. Donc, c'est possible de le faire, mais il faudrait faire des projets avec les communautés autochtones qui peuvent connaître les limites et les droits de toutes les communautés afin de donner les droits des terres aux femmes. Merci beaucoup, Joanne.
Okay, thank you for that, Hindu. That's a very concrete example on the complexities and context of the concept of land rights, both in relation to the collective rights, but also to the rights of men and the rights of women on land. But it's very good that you have also presented the work that you're doing in terms of mapping and empowerment of women. We need to hear more of these stories of highlighting also indigenous women. So now we move on.
On va passer à
Jens,
pasamos
further discussion, and there may be a question to you, and if you have the things that you have not highlighted, you still have the chance. So now we will proceed with the discussion also on territorial governance, self-determination, and natural resources. We have with us Jens Dahl, who is a member of the Permanent Forum. So Jens, you have the floor.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to make a short presentation on the study on autonomy. This is an absolute essential discussion for coping with extractive industries and for the indigenous people's land rights. With a focus on experiences and perspectives, the study on indigenous people's autonomy is basically about options and possibilities for indigenous peoples to promote autonomy and self-government. The report focuses on types of autonomy and distinguishes between territorial autonomy and functional autonomy. Territorial autonomy can be established within a regional, village, or even local city communities. Territorial autonomy is often a preferred model when indigenous peoples make up a majority of the population within specified geographical boundaries. When this is not the case, indigenous peoples may prefer to establish a functional autonomy. In a global context, indigenous peoples generally follow 2 types of functional autonomy, either ethnic autonomy or cultural autonomy. Functional autonomy gives specified rights to all members of the indigenous group. For example, when indigenous groups are allowed to establish their own schools. An increasing number of indigenous peoples live in cities where they sometimes can claim the right to cultural autonomy as a means of recognizing their heritage and their connection with their original homeland. Although cultural autonomy is a rather limited type of autonomy, it may give the indigenous group a platform for further claims. In real life, we may see territorial autonomy in combination with functional autonomy. besides these types of autonomy, there is a question to what extent the autonomy is integrated within the state. And in that respect, the report distinguishes between independent, parallel, and subsumed types of integration. However, most, if not all, autonomies may include components of all three types of integration. The most radical form of indigenous autonomy is when a group decides to live in voluntary isolation. In some cases, the autonomies act to a large extent independent of the state in matters of internal affairs. At the other end, the autonomies are strictly integrated parts of the national political and bureaucratic structure. We may say that the type of autonomy and the degree of integration with the state are the frames within which groups of people can develop the most optimal strategies. The question is, of course, which frame should be aimed for, and what are the factors that could determine which way to follow? Factors dealt with in the report include the significance of demography, how indigenous peoples can organize themselves, when to promote a public type of self-government, and when to promote an ethnic type of self-government. In relation to recognition, there are indigenous peoples who aimed at being recognized in the constitution, others who go to the court system, and still others who try to use a national political system, and again, still others whose only choice is to seek help of international human rights system. Where do indigenous people start when promoting autonomy? An important thing is to stress that there are a number of options depending on the social and political realities and the historical circumstances. Another important aspect to emphasize is that the kind of autonomy can be used as a platform for further claims. And in that connection, allow me just to mention that a newly elected Greenland self-rule government has declared to discontinue the development of a major mining project because it contains uranium. And there is no indication for the time being that this decision will be not.
Groenland a décidé
respetado por el gobierno de Dinamarca.
It is possible to push autonomy limits, even when being up against enormous mining interests. And then allow me just to make a few of the recommendations that the study gives to the Permanent Forum. And this latter is a key point in the study, and this is where the international community, and not the least the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, has an important role to play. The study therefore specifically recommends a forum to further investigate and facilitate an inclusive process aimed at the development of guiding principles for the implementation of indigenous peoples' rights to autonomy, and for that purpose to take contact to the regional human rights commissions. Second, in the continuation of this, a permanent forum should pay further attention to institutions that have been or can be established to promote dialogue between indigenous peoples and governments in order to advance the implementation of indigenous peoples' right to autonomy and self-government. And a third recommendation is that the study recommends, and in accordance with its mandate, that the Permanent Forum should urge and facilitate dialogue between UN programs, funds and agencies, and indigenous peoples regarding indigenous peoples' rights to autonomy in order for the UN system to support processes leading to indigenous autonomies. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to mention the study here. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jens. Thank you for presenting the overview on the study on autonomy. I hope you can share the link to this report or study so we can also share it to the participants. Of course, the issue of self-governance and autonomy is very much linked also on how our rights to our lands, territories, and resources are being exercised, because we cannot isolate or separate the two, the issue of the recognition of our land rights to also our right to self-determination or self-governance. So yes, so that's a very important link to make of why we're having this discussion on autonomy and self-governance. So now I open the floor for some question or comments to Hindu and to Jens. Anyone who wants to take the floor can raise your hand or send your question in the chat box. Anyone? No questions for Hindu or Jens? Okay, it seems like I don't see any hands unless I'm missing it, or no questions so far. Okay, so I just want to ask Hindu, is there any burning issue that you want to say that you were not able to say?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joanne. So what I wanted to say, it's all the new framework around environment that coming up. For example, the 30 by 30 that is going to be discussed soon. So are they going to consider the land right of indigenous peoples? Are they going to consider the women land right theirs? Are they just going to think about the protected area and just like natural park? Are they going to think about our lands? So I think the fight is there, and all the upcoming decisions around the restoration of the ecosystem, because we are going to have the decade of ecosystem restorations around the land management, around the climate change fight. All those must include the provisions of rights of indigenous peoples, access to the land, access to the resources, and it must also include the right to the women, because we are talking about climate change, and women are the ones who are believing in the land of the communities when the men are left to find the solutions in another hand. So I'm just throwing that, and it's very important to have a look on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindu. I thank you for adding the dimension also of the restoration of ecosystem, and that's a very important aspect also of land rights and governance. Jens, any parting word? No? Okay, so we now move then to the next panel, which is the third panel that we have for this meeting. So we are now moving to the strategic lobbying and litigation to influence regional and international bodies and mechanisms. So we will, the first speaker for this panel is Jacqueline Jill Carino. She is representing the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. Jill, you have the floor.
Okay, hello, good evening, and I have been asked to speak on evidence-based advocacy to advance Indigenous peoples' land rights, and I will be speaking particularly from our experience here in the Philippines. So to start, allow me to share some pictures of recent incidents that I think are important as a context on how we do evidence-based advocacy. So in the Philippines today, situation of indigenous peoples is really quite alarming. And for example, in December 2020, 9 indigenous Tumandok land rights defenders were tortured and killed, and 16 were arrested for opposing construction of the Halaur mega dam. And then last February, 22 LUMAD students, 2 teachers, and 2 elders were arrested in the guise of rescuing the students from so-called communist indoctrination. And then last month, 2 indigenous Dumagat were among 9 activists killed in simultaneous military and police operations. And these Dumagats were active in the campaign to stop the construction of 3 mega dams that would displace them from their homeland. And also last month, two prominent Cordillera Indigenous activists
d'une installation importante dans leur communauté autochtone. Et les avocats n'ont pas trouvé de base juridique pouvant protéger et pouvant en quelque sorte assurer une défense.
terrorists who should be
comunistas, terroristas,
massacrer ces personnes. Et parfois, on considère les peuples autochtones comme des communautés progressistes ou comme des communautés communistes. Et les peuples, la situation de pauvreté, d'extrême pauvreté de ces populations est plus qu'aggravée par la pandémie du Covid. Les organisations indigènes, les fédérations,
to come together on a common platform. And in January this year, the Panaghiusa Philippine Network to Uphold Indigenous Peoples' Rights was formed to consolidate the efforts and initiatives of a wide range of organizations working together as a national hub for evidence-based advocacy to advance Indigenous peoples' rights. Evidence-based advocacy requires
le plaidoyer basé sur les preuves nécessite un système de
violations of Indigenous peoples' rights. Various organizations, including indigenous communities, youth, women, churches, and NGOs, all chipped in with their data and analysis from their respective areas of work. And based on the information gathered, Panaghiusa was able to come up with case digests and common positions, which we published and communicated to concerned bodies at national and international levels. We held meetings with international NGOs, human rights organizations, campaigners, and philanthropists to brief them on the situation and to seek their support. So this resulted in numerous statements of concern and political and financial support for the victims. Among those that issued statements were ILC, Amnesty International, IWGIA, AIPP, and many, many more. Another example is the Land Rights Now campaign video on Philippine Indigenous Peoples, which will surely help spread and grow the campaign. United Nations bodies like the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights and Special Rapporteurs also released official statements putting pressure on
des déclarations officielles en faisant des pressions sur
para respetar sus obligaciones.
Statements of support also served to uplift the spirits of the affected Indigenous peoples. So while these expressions of solidarity are certainly encouraging, we are fully aware that Indigenous peoples in the Philippines continue to face dangerous times. And we have just heard news that the government is set to publish a list of terrorists as it implements the new anti-terror law of 2020. And we expect further harassment, arrests, killing, and freezing of assets of red-tagged individuals and organizations, many of whom are indigenous. We also know that in its bid for economic recovery, the government is pushing hard with its Build infrastructure program, including numerous mega dams, economic zones, and mining projects, again threatening indigenous territories. We thus need to urge the Philippine government to stop this red tagging and land grabbing, which endanger indigenous people's survival. So from our experience, internationalizing local issues through evidence-based advocacy brings real benefits for communities and victims of human rights violations. Solidarity expressed through statements, financial contributions, media campaigns, and lobbying governments are some effective forms of support. These are much appreciated and make indigenous communities feel that we are not alone in this fight for justice. Also, holding online meetings, trainings, and webinars such as this are very useful for us. So I now take this opportunity to appeal for continued solidarity and vigilance from the broadest range of actors possible: indigenous, non-indigenous, NGOs, and governments. And in these trying times, indigenous peoples, not only in the Philippines, but worldwide, need all the help we can get to defend our land, lives, and self-determination. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Jill. I think you have highlighted the importance of documentation and for holding series of advocacy activities and building solidarity and strengthening solidarity actions as important activities for the promotion and protection of the rights of indigenous people. So thanks for sharing that experience in the Philippines. Now we move on to Kenya. We have Danielle Kobe, the Executive Director of the Ogiek People's Development Program, or OPDP, to also share his presentation on indigenous people's participation and influence in regional mechanisms. So Danielle, you have the floor.
Thanks, Joanne, and thanks, everybody. Considering the time, I'll just say that the indigenous peoples, basically in Africa, is faced with one issue, which I think it is very important to discuss about the capacity of our institutions among indigenous peoples in Africa. Because many times, we can discuss in such a big Zoom meeting like this, but I can say a lot of them, the technological issues, which is hampering a lot of issues in Africa, making it very impossible for many of them to join such Zoom.
Disons, la technologie est un problème important en Afrique, et il y a beaucoup de gens qui n'ont même pas accès à ces réunions sur
todos los mecanismos en África. Y ahora, por ejemplo, en ámbito de OPDP, que es miembro de la Coalición Internacional de la Tierra, que trabajan con los pueblos indígenas en África, ahora tenemos, digamos, un interés en 10 países africanos, entre los cuales Tanzania, Camerún, Congo, la RDC, y digamos que son mecanismos africanos, es decir, intentamos encontrar cuestiones que especifican.
That's why we have done a lot using the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and we are trying to ensure that indigenous peoples use the frameworks within their territories. That is in Africa, for instance, because sometimes, we can present a lot of statements in every permanent forum, but most of these statements sometimes takes long to get implemented or to be considered within the African setup. So most of these issues are affecting indigenous peoples, and their participation has been a problem. And as CBR5, where we are working with many partners, we are trying to see how we can use that to reach our people on the challenges they are facing. Indigenous people face many things which are related to issues related, as I mentioned, about technology, even management of their institutions. Many times you find the management of their indigenous institution, even apart from activism, the issue of managing even institution is a challenge. So we need to find ways of building and strengthening indigenous people's organization. Also, we should strengthen and protect the human rights defenders, especially environmental defenders, as they are fighting for their forest, for their lands and such like. And another issue which is good to talk about is the mapping of indigenous people's territories, which is always, sometimes you find we are fighting for our rights, for what we are fighting as lands and ancestral land, but we don't necessarily, if you are asked, which land are you talking about? Of course, we talk about all lands, but it is very, very important that we have all these, so that we know exactly what we are claiming. And then also issues of feasibility, whereby issues like what happened in DRC Congo, it takes time. They don't use even social media like Twitter, Facebook. Even sometimes it takes time to reach the world. And there are a lot of dangerous things going on among indigenous peoples areas, and something we have to find ways and means to see how we can uplift so that their visibility and to the indigenous peoples is clear. Many other resources, indigenous people should be given a chance to document things or issues within their territories. One is how to develop even historical with FPIC protocols to develop within their territories, bicultural protocols in their territories, community bylaws, and even
et aussi des règlements.
Tenemos que documentar, por ejemplo.
Even establish centers for their community so that issues related to their communities can easily be understood. And you could realize that a lot of less research, less documentation has been done in Africa. Sometimes we depend on the other world to come and do documentation so that people can know what's happening among Ogiek, among the Maasai, among the Batu or the Pygmies or the San of Botswana and the rest. So we should enhance and also have the exchange visits for them, for the like-minded organization who can support indigenous peoples. Because when we miss this, we then to say, okay, now that there is no traveling, now that COVID-19 is there, most of the indigenous peoples, they cannot participate in most of these forums. And you could only find a few of us being able, but not many of us. And these are some of the issues we find if only we give a chance and support these organizations, these communities, then we are able to say, yes, the indigenous peoples are able to use the regional mechanisms. Because now we have been doing documentation in Tanzania, in Botswana, and other areas to see that some of the challenges indigenous people are facing are fully documented. So maybe that's what I can say for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for highlighting the challenges that indigenous peoples face in Africa to be able to make use of the regional mechanisms, and I hope more support will be given to indigenous organizations in Africa as they also build their capacities. So now we have, last but not the least, speaker. We have Lucy Claridge from the Forest Peoples Program to discuss the role of strategic litigation. Lucy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me along today. So I'm going to very quickly share my screen. I hope you can all see that. I've just put together a very brief whistle-stop tour of some of the major rulings.
Donc, certains des décisions judiciaires les plus importantes.
Ruling of the Inter-American
Aquí la primera sentencia del tribunal tiene
that the right to property under the American Convention of Human Rights would protect indigenous people's property rights. You've also had other rulings in the inter-American system, such as Saramaka against Suriname, which made some very notable points regarding proper safeguards that need to be afforded to indigenous peoples, ensuring their effective participation, free, prior and informed consent, proper benefit sharing, etc. Moving then into Africa, the first ruling in the African system around indigenous peoples was, of course, the Endroys ruling of 2010 against Kenya. So again, a very, very important ruling in being the first time that an African indigenous people's rights over their traditionally owned land was recognized. Moving back then into the inter-American system, we had the 2016 decision regarding the Kalinya and Lukono peoples, which was important in terms of the roles of corporates in human rights abuses. and the court held that the state Suriname had failed to comply with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And this sets a safeguard that businesses must respect the human rights of members of specific groups or populations, including indigenous or tribal peoples. And then, of course, a year later, in 2017, we had the first and only ruling from the African Court of Human and People's Rights on behalf of the Ogiek community, embracing and firmly adopting the concept of Indigenous people's rights, and also making some very clear rulings in relation to the role of Indigenous peoples in conservation. There are many more rulings around Indigenous people's rights, but those are some of the key ones which either I or FPP has been involved in, and I wanted to just highlight. So hopefully you can see that strategic litigation and court judgments can have a real value in creating precedent, in interpreting international law, whether it's UNDRIP, whether it's regional human rights instruments, and promoting the rule of law, in setting norms that states and others need to follow. I think it's fair to say, from my experience in litigating, that litigating on behalf of Indigenous peoples has a huge impact in terms of empowering those communities. And I say that because Indigenous peoples' rights litigation is quite unique in being rooted in self-determination and being rooted in principles such as SPIC. And therefore, during this lengthy court processes, because as we all know, they are lengthy processes, the communities really need to be central to that, and they can learn themselves from the litigation. They can learn what their rights are. They can understand better what court processes are. They can give evidence, and that should be obviously across the community. So elders should give evidence, youth and women. They can also be involved throughout this lengthy process in monitoring human rights abuses which might be persisting on the ground and would be relevant to the litigation process. And they can be very beneficial to have paralegals who are trained to do so. And of course, attendance at court hearings is also very empowering. It demystifies the court process, which can seem very distant, particularly for anyone who's a non-lawyer. And I think Daniel might back me up, but for me, being involved in the Ogiek case and seeing the African Court of Human and People's Rights full of Ogiek attending the hearings, and also when the judgment was delivered, was in itself just a success. It took something that seemed very distant back down to something that was much more approachable for Indigenous communities, in my view. So strategic litigation can also be very helpful in terms of setting up effective processes and remedies. Certainly when working on the Enderoy's decision, which is very broad brush and not very specific in terms of remedies that it set, I learned that for the Ogiek community, they would need to have a more specific framework to ensure that their ruling was implemented. Thinking, for example, how do you possibly quantify how much should be paid to a community for lack of access to their ancestral land, to their territory over a period of 40 years. And certainly there's been a lot of cross-fertilization between the inter-American and the African and other systems in terms of learning from all of these rulings. Arguably, you could say that strategic litigation helps to educate state officials and the judiciary. I think we could probably have a debate for a good number of hours over whether or not that's true. But I do think that successful rulings create media opportunities. They create points to raise public awareness, and they also provide leverage for dialogue with states, with corporations, so that people can be more aware externally what Indigenous community rights are and how they could and should be protected. However, there are, of course, some drawbacks to strategic litigation. I've already talked about how it is a very lengthy process, and it needs a lot of resources, not just for the litigation process itself, but to engage with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, and extensive outreach to keep them together, and make sure that any decisions that are being made are done in full consultation with the community, to ensure that they are able to attend hearings, to ensure that they're able to give evidence, etc. Implementation is another challenge. And I talked about 5 different cases at the very beginning. I think of all of those cases, Awestingni is probably the only one that has been properly or even partially really implemented, which is sad. And it has, you can see the drawbacks. However, I think if we can all come together and collaborate, and also if there are more resources available to encourage this dialogue, also research is needed to see what frameworks exist in a country to implement a regional or international court ruling, and just collaboration. What allies can we all work? What allies can Indigenous communities bring in? Different strengths, different weaknesses that organizations and partners have. And it needs a long-term, holistic, integrated strategy going beyond the litigation itself. And finally, just kind of touching on the lengthy process, of course, you can only go to regional rulings where you have tried to exhaust domestic remedies. In other words, where you've brought the case before a domestic court. And that also has another impact on resources, on the length, and also on just questions around access to justice more generally. I think that's all I probably have time to squeeze in, but thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for that, Lucy. Indeed, I mean, strategic litigation is really one option and mechanism for Indigenous peoples to advance the recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights. Now we now open the floor for questions, comments, not only on the last segment. I actually noticed that there were questions addressed to Jens. Sorry, I was not able to see that earlier. So maybe we can take this opportunity for Jens to respond to the questions in the chat box addressed to Jens. Jens, were you able to see the questions for you?
No.
In the chat box? You did?
I haven't seen it.
Yeah, okay. You cannot see the chat box. Let me see. But others, yeah, I'm trying to search for it now. To Jens, can the permanent forum be instrumental to engage UN agencies, programs, and funds to support Indigenous peoples' struggle for autonomy and government and self-government? Sorry. So the question is, can the permanent forum be instrumental to engage with UN agencies, programs, and funds to support Indigenous peoples' struggle for autonomy and self-governance? What, based on your experience?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of the key roles of the Permanent Forum, is that it has a special relationship with the UN's funds, agencies, and programs. So, and there are none of the other UN mechanism that has that specific relationship with the UN agencies. So I think it's one of the key issues for the Permanent Forum to take up, is to put pressure on the UN agencies and funds for them to develop program in support of the Indigenous peoples' autonomies, and to go in and investigate how can the different agencies fund Indigenous peoples who want to establish some kind of autonomy, and also to establish a dialogue with Indigenous peoples. How can we deal with autonomy? How can we promote autonomy? What are the issues that should be raised for governments and for Indigenous peoples to discuss autonomy? So that, I think there are not a lot of options, and I think the Permanent Forum is exactly the best of the UN institutions to raise this issue to the funds.
Okay, thanks for that, Jens. There's actually another question for you. I have a question for Jens. First of all, thank you for the presentation. My question is, do you have any concrete recent examples to share a successful exercise of autonomy models in the context of COVID-19? Yeah, maybe while you're thinking about it, I have some example later I can share, but while you're thinking about it, we have Nimal Wihanila, who raised her hand. So I'll get back to you, Jens, on that question. If
okay,
later, if you can think of an example. But Nimal, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. I just wanted to kind of support for the Kobe's recommendation, like for example, IP's organization or IP institution. That is because of, for example, when you are fighting for the protected area and land rights or other traditional knowledge issues, we can, for example, we can use Nagoya Protocol or CBD, or we can use the protected area document. But for that, where is the knowledge?
La déclaration comme document.
People organization, not
La
only
gente tiene que organizarse, no solamente.
It must go to the country wise, because the country wise, it is true that the most of the time the issues are same, but the way you the way you find the solution is different. So in that case, you need to strengthening country-wise IP's organization. So that way, it also helping to policy and lobbying. So otherwise, when you are talking in the top level, you cannot do if you can't bring the things to the grassroots level. So this gap's always there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Nima. Thank you for your recommendation. I think that's also what Daniel has mentioned, that this capacity building are actually from local and national levels for them to be able to engage at the regional level. So thank you for stressing that point again. Do we now, Jens, you?
Yeah.
Okay.
But of course, the COVID has infected indigenous peoples in all parts of the world, also in the North communities of Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, and the Northern Scandinavia. Greenland has been, what I would say, fairly successful because they have been able to control traveling in and out of the country, and they have been able to control their own rules inside the country. So they have been relatively successful, and there have, to the best of knowledge, been no death in Greenland in relation to COVID-19. So I think if we should learn anything about it, is that if you have a quite substantial autonomy, then you can do something if you want to do something.
Okay, thanks for that, Jens. Is there any other question or comments from the participants? We still have some time. I can still take 3 questions before we wrap up for the concluding remarks. But maybe just to add to that question, there's many actually of the indigenous communities in Indonesia who are practicing self-governance at the local level, were able to contain the problem of COVID by coming out with their own restrictions. So they declare their own lockdowns, they declare their own rules on maintaining health and sanitation in their communities, and more importantly, on how they plan their self-reliance on food. So they have discussed how they did an evaluation of how much food they have. They projected their own production and how the community can work together to beef up their supply of food so that they don't need to get it from the outside. So that's quite a very comprehensive approach that was really exercised under self-governance, no, by the communities. And the important thing here is that there were also the participation of women in decision making, especially because they know a lot about herbal medicine. So their point on ensuring health and also nutritious food for the children were accounted for. So That's one example I can cite in relation to the exercise of self-governance in addressing COVID. I see Jill. Jill?
Yes. Yeah, I noticed two questions here in the chat box, which I'd like to respond to.
Okay.
First, there's a question on, are there specific forms of evidence-based documentation recommended, and does AIPP have guidelines, and what are considered the value of disaggregated data collection? Yes, we do have guidelines for doing documentation of human rights violations, and AIPP has its own. Also here in the Philippines, we are using a standard template to be able to get the necessary data needed in coming up with these reports. And the basic outline is who, where, what, when, how, so that all the necessary data is put in there. And it's really important also to have disaggregated data for Indigenous peoples and also for women and men, so that we see how disproportionate the violations or the marginalization or denial of services are really for Indigenous peoples. And then there's another question here that from Manja, asking me to share as a positive example the impact of legal mechanism in thwarting threats against Indigenous peoples defending their rights. A case in the Philippines where a court directed the police to stop red tagging IP activists had notable impact. And yeah, this is true here in Baguio City, where I live, where red tagging of everybody of the Cordillera People's Alliance and many youth activists is really happening every day through social media, through posting of posters. And what the youth activists did was to file in the court for a writ of amparo and a writ of habeas data. These are legal remedies available here in the Philippines to force the perpetrators to actually stop doing red tagging, because it endangers the lives of these people who are subjected to red tagging. And it was quite successful, and the police were ordered to stop posting statements that really endanger the lives of the activists. So I think that's a good thing to share. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that additional points, Jill, and responding also to the questions. We have 5 minutes left before we conclude this session. So unless there are anyone who wants to say something, I would then proceed with the concluding remarks of this important conversation for today. So I'm not sure if I have missed out anything on the chat box. I hope not. But in any case, if
John,
yes,
there's a question from Gui Makuluka.
Yes.
He can speak in French if he would like to present.
Okay, quickly, please. The question. Who has a Gui Makaluka? Can kindly, yes, you have the floor for your question. You have the floor. Where is Gui or Guy? I don't see. I don't see.
There's a translation in the chat.
My question to know is the strategy of the CB15 regional initiative on what are strategies undertaken for sustainability of the actions of sustainable development carried out by Indigenous through organizations which accompany them. Is this the one?
Yes, it's the translation.
Yes, okay. Who wants to respond to this question? Anyone from the speakers who want to respond? It puts into bracket the regional initiative of Indigenous peoples land rights. So I'm not clear what this is actually referring to, but if anyone knows this, please feel free to respond. I don't see, sorry, I don't see anyone responding to this question, but I hope we can get back to you later, Guy or Gui. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, but hopefully we can get back to you on your question. Now that we have reached our time, we only have 5 minutes left or less. So I just want to make some a brief of a summary on the discussion that we had today, which was first the presentation of the report, the comprehensive report of the Permanent Forum, highlighting the inherent right of indigenous peoples to our lands, territories, and resources. And it's that it is imperative for us to be able to survive collectively, and also in relation to our culture, our health, our political, economic, and well-being. So that's the context. And now we are facing serious challenges, and these challenges relate very much to land grabbing by the extractive industry, by agribusiness. She mentioned, for example, the issue of palm oil as a major issue, but also this comes with a lot of conflicts happening in indigenous territories. And thereby, there's a need for real actions, particularly from the duty bearers, which are the states, because they have the duty to respect and protect these rights. And for us as indigenous peoples with the rights, we also need to engage in dialogues with states for them to take action to protect our rights. So real dialogues and engagement with states is important in advancing the recognition of our rights. So we also heard from our youth representative the issue of the importance of food production and our economic control of our resources instead of being given to companies, because especially now under the pandemic, right, that we need to ensure food for our people. But this is a big challenge as we are being again taken out or evicted from our resources. So now we also Hindu highlighted the concept of land rights in relation to how collective land rights are going to be recognized, but also the challenges in relation to individual land rights, particularly of women, but also the importance of working with women at the grassroots level, including in relation to mapping women's lands and also providing support for their economic empowerment. Now, on the territorial governance, Jens has presented to us options on autonomy and self-governance of indigenous peoples, and these are very much linked, of course, to the exercise also on the way we manage our lands, territories, and resources. And the options for autonomy have considerations for the history and the political context of each indigenous peoples to determine. And at the same time, he also highlighted the need to engage again in a political dialogue with states on the recognition of our right to self-governance. Now, on the strategic litigation, I think Jill was presented the case of the Philippines on how from the numerous cases of violations of indigenous people's rights, they were able to document these cases and present this into an evidence-based advocacy activities at different levels, no, from national, regional to global, and meeting different stakeholders or key actors on the issue of human rights. And these have been useful in generating attention to these issues of the violations of Indigenous people's rights. Now, Danielle, who has an experience in using regional mechanism, has also highlighted the need. What are the enabling environment or capacities that Indigenous peoples need to be able to engage in regional mechanisms? And he highlighted the need for raising more visibility on the issues of Indigenous peoples, which again is related on the capacity to do documentation, use social media, and other platforms, and also the need for communities to be able to develop their FPIC protocols, strengthen their organizations, including having a community center so that they can discuss their issues, as well as also having exchange visits as a learning platform for Indigenous peoples to learn from each other's experience in terms of advocacy and also using regional mechanisms. And finally, for Lucy has concretely presented specific cases where strategic litigation has proven to be effective in at least upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples. And it is strategic litigation is important in setting norms and precedents in the recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights, including having access to justice or getting proper compensation, which is also empowering Indigenous communities. And however, strategic litigation requires that community needs to be central in the litigation processes, including documentation, attendance to court cases, etc. But the other benefits of engaging in strategic litigation is it also educates the legal community, judges, prosecutors, and even lawyers, and opens up dialogues with states and corporations to deal with these cases of violations to Indigenous people's rights. At the same time, we also need to recognize the challenges in relation to strategic litigation, which is resource extensive and also requires time and capacities from Indigenous peoples to engage. However, this can also be addressed by strengthening collaboration and providing support to communities when they decide to undertake this strategic litigation. So these were the key points that came out in the presentation and the discussions. And I think one of the recommendations that came out immediately is also the issue of looking at reviewing national laws and advocating for reforms of these laws, especially laws that were developed during the colonial times that are very discriminatory to Indigenous peoples and are directly violating our rights to our lands, territories, and resources. That is a critical point in advancing the recognition of our rights. The other elements that came out is the need, again, as stressed by one of our colleagues, is to provide and support communities at the local level and at the national level on how they can engage with the regional mechanisms, but also in building their capacities. And finally, the need to do more collaboration, more building alliances with others in this important endeavor as we try to address and advance the rights of indigenous peoples for our land rights and territorial rights. So with that, I think there were other recommendations that came out, and I hope this event has been very useful to everyone. I want to thank all the speakers for their presentations. I also want to thank all the participants and also the interpreters. And by the way, I just want to, I forgot to mention the question on the format for documentation. At the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, we also have the template used to document cases, but I just want to mention that when we submit communication to the UN human rights system, which is important because it's they can raise these issues directly to the government, but we need to get also the consent of the victims and or their families. So let's be mindful that when we do documentation and we want to submit these cases for the UN to raise attention and on these cases, that is part of the process. So that's just an addition from my end. But in any case, I hope this discussion that we had today, the discussion on advancing land and territorial rights of indigenous peoples, is not going to end in this meeting, but let's continue to discuss this and continue to collaborate and have more joint activities on these very, very important issues for indigenous peoples. Thank you. And on behalf of all the organizers from the International Land Coalition, the International Work Group on Indigenous Affairs, the Forest Peoples Program, and the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, I wish to express our gratitude to all of you for participating in this event. Thank you and have a good day or good night.